Ron White grew up in California. He graduated from UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, Princeton Theological Seminary, and then he got his PhD from Princeton University. And he has taught at UCLA. He's been Dean of Students at Princeton. He's been on the staff and teacher at Whitworth College. And he's been a pastor, a college chaplain, a dean. And then late in life, he decided that he would follow through on his interest in particularly American presidents, and in particular, Abraham Lincoln. And so he's written a best-selling book on Abraham Lincoln, A. Lincoln, and then just about 6 years ago, Ulysses Grant, American Ulysses. And it has struck me, Ron, about you, that I'll just say one thing about you as a person. Ron is one of the most curious people I have ever met. He is curious when he comes to New Zealand about New Zealand history, and he keeps reading from his history book and telling us about different anecdotes from your history, your past. But he follows through on what interests him. He's curious, and he has much to teach us and to tell us today about leadership. Ron, it's a great pleasure to introduce you.
We arrived a week ago yesterday in Auckland, and we're driving North Island, South Island. We are so grateful for the hospitality, the friendship, and what we have learned. I'm very much struck by the Prime Minister, and I'm reading her biography right at this moment and learning a great deal. I love what she says. I really rebel against the idea that politics has to be a place full of ego, where you're really constantly focused on scoring points against one another. Yes, we need a robust democracy, but you can be strong and kind. I'm fascinated by biography. Most of us entered into the 21st century very hopeful about this world. The wall came down in Berlin. The Soviet Union collapsed. We looked forward to what we thought would be a brighter day, and yet we've watched through these 20 years of the 21st century the rise of autocratic, strong men, including in the United States. And we've seen this around the world. I took a group of Presbyterian young people to Poland, and after the Soviet Union fell, I thought Poland will be such a great example, and it was for a few years. And now it's been taken over by the Law and Justice Party, and I learned that they take their slogan from Psalm 33, the Law and Justice Party. They are out to destroy the judiciary. It's just amazing what is taking place. So why do we then read biography? I think we read biography because we're looking for examples from the past. We're looking for moral examples, for moral courage. I think we also read biography because, therefore, they are a mirror to the present. They hold up to us, do they not? Who are our leaders? Who do we want to be? So I'm talking about leadership, but it's not simply a president or a prime minister. It's really who each of us is as a parent, as a leader in business, or a school teacher, or in business. I have approached biography from a couple of distinctive, perhaps, points of view. I write from what I call from the inside out. From the inside out. I'm very much interested in character. How is a person formed or shaped? Biography, even as reading is going down, publishers tell us that biographies remain popular, even big, long biographies. But sometimes those biographies, from my perspective, skip very quickly over the young person's life. So, for example, Ulysses S. Grant, we're not really able to talk too much about him today, but he arrived at West Point at age 17, 5 feet 1 inches tall, 115 pounds, not really very well educated. So I spent a week at West Point trying to understand the formation. Think of your own lives when you were 16, 18, 20, 22. Were not those the formative periods of your life that formed? Oh, surely you're a different person. I take my cue from Grant himself, who said, the reason I don't read biographies is that they do not tell me enough about the young person. I want to know about the formative period of a person's life, who they then would become as an adult. So the contrast of leaders is very apparent to us. What I've decided to do is to take this text of Lincoln's second inaugural address, it's only 701 words, and use it kind of as a template to explore together what might be the qualities of leadership that we would wish in leaders today. Now, we have to say at the outset, of course, Lincoln can't help us with climate change. He can't tell us what to do about the virus. He's not able to tell us what we should be doing in Afghanistan. But I think he's one of those very few historical figures whose spirit, whose ideas still somehow speak across time. I've been amazed. I've been invited to speak on Lincoln in England, France, Germany, Italy, Mexico, and now wonderful New Zealand. Lincoln travels well. He's kind of a man for all seasons. Let me begin by asking, how many of you have been to the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C.? Quite a few of you. If you go there, the National Park Service will tell you it's the second most visited place in Washington, second only to the Vietnam Memorial. If you will, just in a word or two, could you get in touch with the experience that happened to you when you were there? What did you feel? What did you experience there? Just say it out loud in a word or two. What was it like for you to be at the Lincoln Memorial? Awesome. Inspiring. Moving.
I felt small.
Moved.
I felt small.
You felt small. It's a large statue, but you felt small. If you walk into that temple space, on one side is the Gettysburg Address, only 272 words. Took Lincoln 2.5 minutes. He was a secondary invitation. Edward Everett, who was the greatest orator of the day, he'd been president of Harvard, the United States ambassador to England. He spoke for 2 hours and 8 minutes before Lincoln got up to speak. On the right side, carved in Indiana limestone, is the second inaugural address. It's in front of you, it's 701 words. The Gettysburg Address is the one that is most famous, although the Times of London bashed it as the voice of a village lawyer. But it came through on the second inaugural, the Times of London. They saw its greatness. But I focused on this address because Lincoln called it my best effort. But then, in response to someone who congratulated him, he offered these remarkable words, but it's not immediately popular. I want you to think about that, and towards the end, I'm going to ask you a question. Why do you think Lincoln thought it was not immediately popular? Well, let's look at it together. It is 701 words. 505 words are one syllable. Lincoln mentions God 14 times, quotes the Bible 4 times, and invokes prayer 3 times. Now, you might think, or I did think, this was usual for an American political address, but I read the previous 18 inaugural addresses, and the Bible was mentioned only 1 time. John Quincy Adams, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. But the irony of Lincoln is that he was about the only American president who never joined a church. Well, how could he never join a church and write a document that appears to be so religious, so filled with faith? Well, the scholars told me, as I started out later in life, well, don't get too excited. Lincoln is simply quoting the Bible like someone would quote Shakespeare in the 19th century. No. This is the most complex, sophisticated theological document, as we will show and see. Let's refresh our memories before we start the text. Lincoln was born in 1809 in Kentucky, lived there with his parents. He moved in 1816 to Indiana. He had but 1 year of formal education. What do I mean by that? Well, those days, living on a farm, boys were only able to receive education in January and February when it was too cold to work with their fathers on the farm, and families would hire teachers that kind of came through, and they'd hire them for 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 children. He did that 5, 6 times. Maybe he had 10 months, possibly 12, of formal education. He then moved with his family to Illinois, separated from them and moved to the tiny village of New Salem, and ran for political office for the first time when he was 23 years of age. He was defeated, but in the region where he lived, he received 279 of 305 votes. And 2 years later, as more people knew him, 14 men ran for four elected offices. He finished second of the 14 men. He served one term in the United States Congress. Twice he ran for the United States Senate, which until the 20th century was elected by legislatures. He lost. He lost in famous debates to Stephen Douglas, and then was elected president in 1860. The first Republican to be president. The Republicans were the successors of what was called the Whigs in the United States. So Lincoln begins this address. At this second appearing to take the oath of the presidential office, there is less occasion for an extended address than there was at the first. Does everybody have a copy of this? Anybody missing a copy? Do we need to hand out any? Everybody's okay? Okay, just want to be sure. Or you can share it. You're right? We could. Okay. There is less occasion for an extended address at the first. Well, this is not exactly 407 years ago. There's nothing particularly outstanding, seems to be, in this first sentence. What is Lincoln doing? Well, I want to suggest that in the first paragraph, Lincoln breaks every rule of modern political leadership. We have been enduring or enjoying, depending on your point of view, these democratic debates that keep going on and on and on. And whatever the debate is, perhaps this is true in your country too, politicians today promise everything they're going to do for us. I will do this, and I will do that, and I will do this. Lincoln makes no promises whatsoever. In fact, he takes just the opposite track. He tells the people what he cannot do for them. The second line, there is less occasion for an extended address than there was at the first. Line 8, the left-hand side, little that is new could be presented. At the end of the first paragraph, the last sentence, no prediction in regard to it is ventured. What a strange way to begin an address, to tell people what he cannot do. Amazing. In the second paragraph, we begin to get a sense of the question that Lincoln is asking. Whether we realize it or not, really, often as you enter into a conversation, it's what is the question? And Lincoln, I think, is asking a question that no one else was asking. He's asking the question, how at the end of this war can the South be brought back into the Union? He understands, as the politicians did not, the preachers did not, and the professors did not, that if the South is meant to bear the blame and the shame, they will never be able to re-enter this Union. I wanted to understand who was there that day at the inauguration. Our presidents are elected for 4 years, and so Lincoln came for his inauguration. It was a cold, windy, muddy, dreary day. There were 25 to 35,000 people present. I didn't know when I wrote my first book how many people could actually hear Lincoln. I learned from others. I've not been to Turkey, but I'm told that in Turkey there are amphitheaters built that are usually 8,000 to 9,000 people. And a practiced public speaker could be heard by that many people. So I read the diaries and the letters of the people who were there that day, and I was surprised by what I read. Because inaugurations are usually occasions of great celebration, especially if it's your party or your candidate. And I thought people would be in a celebratory mood, but that wasn't their mood at all. They were angry. They were deeply angry. Why do you think they were angry? Because every person there had probably lost a father, husband, son, brother, and they were angry, and they wanted Lincoln to give voice to that anger. Cynthia and I went to your National Museum yesterday and saw that amazing, amazing exhibit of Gallipoli. My goodness, what an exhibit. How it takes your breath away to try to understand that, and what that must have meant for the loss of young manhood in this nation. Well, that's what those people felt that day, and they were angry. The parade in those days was before Lincoln's address, and there was a parade float with a newspaper on it, and tossing out newspapers to the crowd. and the newspaper headline said, "This is the day Lincoln ought to crow a bit. This is the day he ought to crow a bit. He's endured all this criticism for 4 years. Lincoln's war, 750,000 men died. He's got to crow a bit today." That's what we do, don't we, when we have events like this? But Lincoln would not crow a bit. Do you know that in the Gettysburg Address there's not one personal pronoun? Not one. I say Lincoln disappears. In this address there's only 2 personal pronouns? Can you imagine a modern politician not saying I? Lincoln does not talk that way. He's talking about bigger ideas than himself. He points beyond himself to those ideas. So how is he going to answer the question, who is to blame for the war? He does so by what I call his use of inclusive language. Inclusive language. Listen to this language, the second paragraph. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. Towards the end of the paragraph, both parties deprecated war. What does inclusive language do? Lincoln is imputing the best possible motive to those that the audience thought was the enemy, the opponent. He's saying the people of the South didn't want this war any more than the people of the North. Wouldn't that be amazing in our modern politics if we could impute the best possible motive to our opponent? They're just as patriotic. They just love New Zealand or love the United States as we do. We disagree on ideas. We disagree on policies. That's fine. But the best possible motive. Well, I was saying this for the first time I ever gave this address was at the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And I was charging along with my remarks, and a professor put up his hand. He was a professor of English literature. And he said, "But Dr. White," he said, don't you have to admit at the end of that second paragraph, Lincoln is blaming somebody. Just look at it, he said. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. He stumped me for a minute or 2 or 3. But let me put it this way. What if Lincoln had said, both parties deprecated war, but those traitors, those Confederates, those tyrants, I think he very self-consciously chose not to use those kind of inflammatory words, and he used this remarkable generic word, but one of them. I think we ought to be very attuned to what politicians do not say. Oh, I wish someone would not use Twitter. It takes a lot of self-control to not say something. After the Battle of Gettysburg, the Union had won the battle, but there were 50,000 dead, wounded, and missing. Robert E. Lee's Southern troops were battered. He struggled to make his way back over the Potomac River back into the home territory of the state of Virginia. And Lincoln thought that George Meade, the commander, would surely follow Lee and beat up on his staggering, battered army, but Meade didn't move. And day after day, as Lincoln sat in the telegraph office, he said, "What in the world is Meade doing? Why doesn't he go after this army?" And Lee then was stopped by the Potomac River, which was flooding. Finally, Meade starts out days later, gets to the Potomac as the last Confederate soldier crosses into Virginia. Lincoln sits down. He writes this letter. He says, "George Meade, do you not realize what you have done? You have probably extended this war for at least a year," and he goes on and on and on and on. But at the Library of Congress, I was privileged to see that letter. On the outside, Lincoln wrote, "Never signed, never sent. Never signed, never sent." Why would he send a letter? To destroy George Meade? To make him resign? There are 6 great letters that Lincoln writes, never signed, never sent. Wow. That's leadership. Not to give voice to your anger, not to be filled with your temper, but to look at the big picture. Lincoln, I say, only had 1 year of formal education, but he had some very remarkable literary devices, which are often used by ministers. And the devices, this one, listen for it, it's in the second paragraph again. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war. Okay, here's an extra credit question. Lincoln uses the consonant D 8 times in those couple of sentences. What do we call that? We call that alliteration. We call it alliteration, where you take the same consonant and you repeat it over and over and over again. I was giving this talk in Phoenix, Arizona, and there were two 13-year-old girls sitting in the front seats. And when I asked the question, the one 13-year-old girl jumped out of her chair. She must have just been studying this in school, and she answered correctly. So I started on, and suddenly the other 13-year-old girl jumped out of her chair, and she said, "Do you mean that Lincoln decided in advance to use the consonant eight times?" I said, "I don't think so. But I think he had a sense for the sound of words." You know, you and I read silently. This is a very modern invention. Nobody ever read silently until about 140 years ago. Maybe it was a warm or a windy day in Wellington, and the teacher at 3 p.m. said, "Johnny, you're disturbing Mary. Read to yourself." So we've adopted this bad habit of reading to ourselves. Lincoln always read out loud. Grant always read out loud. And he read out loud because he said, then I get words in two ways. I get what I see, and I get what I hear. And I discovered a few years after I started living with Lincoln, I think my wife will tell you I actually am living with Lincoln, that he would actually say the word before he would put it on the paper. He wanted to get the sound of that word before he put it down. Alliteration, what does it do for you and me, the listener? Unconsciously, it kind of connects the ideas. It connects the thoughts. And sometimes, just like in music, it's a crescendo where the words are building to a climax. And what's the climax of this paragraph? It's the last sentence. If the text is 505 words out of 701 are one syllable, the last sentence is 4 words and 4 syllables. 750,000 dead in a nation of 30 million. Lincoln now, in the first 2 paragraphs, has been sort of narrating what took place. Edward Everett had spent 2 hours and 8 minutes describing the battle. So the battle is really the action of the soldiers, the generals, and of Lincoln as commander-in-chief. Direct object. Suddenly, in the last paragraph, Lincoln reverses it. And the war is now the subject. It's not the direct object. At that address at Colorado Springs at the Air Force Academy, my host was a Marine Corps officer who told me on one day in Vietnam he was wounded 38 times. He survived, became a military chaplain, and when we left the Air Force Academy, he said to me words that I didn't fully understand at the time. This was way back in 2002. He said, "Ron, a war is coming, and we will be told by our political leaders that we will win that war very quickly, and we will be told by our military leaders we will win that war very quickly because we're the greatest military in the world." But he said, "Don't believe it. Don't believe it." This is a Marine telling me this. He said, "The next war will spin out of our control, and it will go on and on and on and on, and it's still going on." Well, the North thought they would win the war very quickly in 3 to 6 months. They had twice as many men in arms, a much greater industrial base, but the war was going on, and Lincoln had begun to understand that he wasn't in control of this war. The generals weren't in control of this war, and so he offers this final sentence at the second paragraph, and the war came. The war is now the subject. It's not the direct object. Well, you've been wrestling with this text for a while. How do you think he said that last sentence? How do you think he said it? Do you have anybody? We don't have any recording of his address, obviously, but how do you think he might have said that final sentence of the second paragraph? Yes?
Very softly.
Very softly. Yes. Yeah. With regret, yes. Mournfully. How can you rejoice with 750,000 dead, even if your side appears to be winning? Very slowly, mournfully, softly. The third paragraph, the longest in the address, is Lincoln almost as an historian or as a chronicler, kind of summing up what has happened. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. We have a big debate still going on in our country as to what is the cause of the war. 2011 was the beginning of the 150th year commemorating the war, and the Pew Charitable Trust put out a survey asking a sample of Americans, what do you think was the cause of the war? And the answers were all over the map. Only the group over 65 said the cause of the war was slavery. The young people, 18 to 29, they were everywhere. It's clear slavery was the cause of the war. That evening on public television, a history professor from the University of South Carolina said, slavery was the basis of this war. Don't try to walk around it. And Lincoln says, everybody knew that somehow this was the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents, that's the Confederates, would rend the Union, even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Lincoln, at the beginning of the war, felt bound by a constitution that said he did not have the right to do something in the South where slavery already existed. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration for which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict, slavery, might cease with, or even before the conflict itself should cease, because he offered an Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, freeing most, not but most of the slaves. Each side looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. And now there's a transition in this address. Suddenly what was purely a political address, Lincoln now starts using religious language, and I've outlined for you, or bolded for you, 4 different passages from the Bible, 2 from the Old Testament and 2 from the New. Both read the same Bible. Notice the inclusive language. He's saying to this northern audience, listen, the Confederate soldiers read the Bible every bit as much as the Union soldiers and pray to the same God. And then there's a semicolon. We've allowed the semicolon to drop out of our language. Lincoln uses it again and again and again, and often for him it's a time where he kind of shifts the direction of his thinking. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, semicolon, and each invokes his aid against the other. I think Lincoln is really saying, how dare each side invoke God's aid against the other? Do we worship a territorial God? What kind of a God is this that takes this kind of side? Lincoln was beseeched by ministers and politicians who came to him to say, God is on our side, God is on our side. He knew that Jefferson Davis, the leader of the Confederacy, was receiving the same people, God is on our side. One time Lincoln leapt out of his chair and said, I'd like to figure out how I can get to be on God's side. But this was the chauvinism that's then and now, God is on our side. But then he moves on. It may seem strange that any man should dare to ask a just God's assistance in bringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. Genesis 3:19. I looked for the antecedents to this address. Did Lincoln say these words before? Did he write them down before? I couldn't find them. If you look at Martin Luther King's great I Have a Dream speech, you will discover that he had said some of those words in other places. It all kind of came together, but he'd said them before. But 3 months to the day before this address, 2 women came to see him. Women had learned that Lincoln was a softy, and women came to plead with him, especially with their tears. He hated what he called Butcher's Day, which was Friday, when the generals would send him the order, execute this man, execute, 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 because the man failed to failed to show up for duty, ran from the line, whatever. Lincoln wrote back to one of the generals, "I think this man might do better above ground than below ground." And the man went on to win the Medal of Honor. But these two women said, "We are Christian women, and our husbands are Christian men, officers of the Confederacy in a Union prison. And we want to appeal to you on behalf of our husbands." Well, Lincoln, who drove his secretaries crazy, said, "Come back tomorrow. Let's continue this conversation." So after the second day, he said to these women, "Would you like to come back tomorrow? We'll keep talking." But on the third day, he said to these women, "I find it very difficult when you tell me your husbands are Christian men. How can Christian men go against the duly constituted authority of this government?" And then I think he quoted this Genesis 3:19 right from memory. I don't have a Bible in front of me, but if I did, I would say something like this. Sometimes those of us who are Christians allow the Bible to be back there and then. It's an old story 2,000 years ago. What Lincoln is doing is saying, no, the Bible is here and now. He's taking Genesis 3:19 and he's saying, your husbands are getting the bread for their best interest from the slavery of other people. And then he said to these two women, I don't think that's the kind of religion that gets people to heaven. And he asked them to leave. But out in the hallway was a newspaper reporter who he called in and said, I want you to write this down. He said, I might want to use this someday. He did 3 months to the day later. But there's another semicolon. My goodness. I think, and I'm imagining here, that Lincoln may have at this point thought, boy, that sounds pretty harsh. I'm pretty judgmental. And so suddenly he brings in what? Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. But let us judge not, that we be not judged. And so the real ethic of this address is not triumphalism, is not crow a bit. It's forgiveness. It's reconciliation. Nobody in the crowd wanted it. Lincoln's supporters were surprised by it. But this is what he offered on that particular day. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. And now Lincoln, I believe, is suggesting that in addition to the actions of the soldiers, the generals, and the commander-in-chief, there's another actor, a silent actor, who's also acting in history. Well, Lincoln grew up in his journey to do what maybe some of you or your children or grandchildren have done. He was born into a Christian family. They were Baptist, living on the frontier in what we would call the Second Great Awakening. It was a very emotional kind of religion, and Lincoln didn't like emotion. He would come out at age 9 and stand on a stump and repeat the minister's sermon word for word until his father hit him on the backside and told him to get home. Well, Lincoln rejected the faith of his parents. He became what he called a fatalist, or what we might call a deist. As that young man in New Salem, he wrote a paper criticizing the Bible, criticizing what he called revealed religion, until a friend of his, knowing that Lincoln was running for political office, took it out of his hand and threw it in the fire. That's not something you do if you want to run for political office in the 1830s in America. But then, as it happens for all of us, life tumbled in. First, it was the death of Willie in 1850, just 3.5 years old. And Lincoln and Mary went looking for the Episcopal minister who had married them, but he was out of town, and he heard there was a new young Presbyterian minister who'd only been there 10 months. They invited James Smith to come and do the funeral service, which in those days was always done in the home. Well, James Smith had written a book kind of defending the authority of the Bible, and Lincoln's son said that of the few books that Lincoln had in his home in Springfield, it was James Smith's book. And James Smith had had a similar journey from Lincoln. Smith had come from Scotland. He was also a deist, a fatalist. Then he went to an extremely emotional, evangelistic tradition, and finally found himself a Presbyterian because he said Presbyterians were thoughtful. Our faith cannot be based on feeling. It ultimately must be based on thought and reason. And Lincoln was drawn to James Smith. Then Lincoln is elected president, and many churches want him to accept a free pew, which people did in those days. And he was drawn to Phineas Densmore Gurley at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. Gurley had finished number one in his class at Princeton Seminary. Was an outstanding preacher. And at Willie's death, now the second boy that would die in 1862, Gurley presided over the funeral service in the White House. Mary was so overcome with grief she could not come, and she wore black every day for the rest of her life. She was so overcome. Gurley preached that sermon, and we have the sermon, and he leans forward, I think, to Lincoln, and he says, I ask you to trust in biblical providence. I ask you to trust in biblical providence. What is providence? Providence is really the belief of Christians in a loving God with personality who loves human beings and does act in history. So we'll notice the word providence in this document. Lincoln is no longer a fatalist. My dialogue with other historians is that they keep him being a fatalist, whereas Lincoln's on a journey. You and I are on a journey. We're not the same person at 40 or 60 or 80 that we were at 20. And Lincoln's on a journey. Finally, the address switches one more time with quite dramatic words. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. Well, his audience would have understood what an American audience wouldn't today at all, but you may or may not understand that this has sounded to the audience like a Jeremiad. What do I mean by a Jeremiad? In the early, as the Puritans first came to New England, by the second or certainly by the third generation, the ministers would preach what they called Jeremiads. They said, you have forgotten the faith of your grandparents. You have forgotten the faith of your parents. You have, and then he would enunciate what they have done. So when the audience hears Lincoln with this denunciatory word, they're sort of asking, and what have we done? And he answers their question. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses. Now, if he had omitted the word American, the audience probably would have applauded, oh, he's speaking to the South. They're the bad guys at this thing. But when he says American, we're all involved in this. Don't point your finger somewhere else. We're all involved. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses, which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in the living God always ascribe to him? I said this is a complex theological document. For the longest time, I couldn't figure out what Lincoln meant when he used the words divine attributes. So I turned to people smarter than me. I'm an historian. They were theologians. And I said, what does he mean by divine attributes? And my friend Don McKim said, that's the Westminster Confession of Faith. That's the Westminster Confession of Faith. That's what would have been the catechism for anybody attending a Presbyterian church. The Westminster Confession of Faith in chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3 talks about the divine attributes of God. So when Lincoln is viewed as, well, maybe this is Presbyterian religion. The divine attributes, this is the Westminster Confession of Faith. This is where Lincoln heard this surely at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray. Do you hear the alliteration again? That this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. On the Sunday after Fort Sumter, we do know that Lincoln was sitting in the pew as Gurley preached. And what did Gurley preach on? We have his sermon, The Mighty Scourge of War. The mighty, that's an unusual word. The mighty scourge of war. In our day, ministers don't have the kind of public cachet that they did 50 or 100 years ago. And I love to be able to say, ministers don't I think, get the credit that they deserve. And behind wonderful people in the congregation is a minister who's working so carefully and thoughtfully to prepare sermons for us Sunday by Sunday by Sunday. And Lincoln was listening to Gurley as Gurley preached those sermons. Yet if God wills that it continue, you see, God wills. Who is the actor here? If God wills. Until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, Well, you're sitting in the audience, it's cold and windy and rainy, and you're saying to yourself, 250 years, my goodness, he's going right back to the beginning of this nation. Slavery was here right from the beginning, and we didn't do anything about it for all this time. 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sung until every drop of blood drawn with a lash, slavery, shall be paid by another drawn with a sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. In the audience that day was Frederick Douglass. He's the greatest African American of the 19th century. Our highest prize is the Pulitzer Prize, and David Blight's magnificent biography of Frederick Douglass won the Pulitzer Prize for 2019. Douglass was disappointed in Lincoln's first inaugural address, but Lincoln invited Douglass to come and meet him at the White House after the Emancipation Proclamation offered the possibility of perhaps blacks might fight in the Union Army. That next Sunday, Douglass told an audience in Philadelphia, I have never met a man like this. I put my card in and people told me you might wait 48 hours to see him in about 10 minutes. And when I entered the room, Lincoln stood up. He stood up to meet me with respect. It's not that I agree with everything, but I know when a man is treating me with respect or not. So Douglass was in the audience for the second inaugural address. He looked around him. He understood that not everybody understood exactly what was Lincoln saying. Douglass wrote later of that day, this was a sermon, not a state paper. This was a sermon. But what are sermons then and now, I think? I think sermons really are composed of two parts. We may not know this language, but the first part is what I would call the indicative. It's when the minister or the priest or the rabbi announces to us what God has done. For those of us who are Christian, what God has done in the person, teaching, life, death, resurrection of Jesus. But the second part, and it might be done differently, Cynthia and I have worshipped in many different churches, is when the minister then says, and therefore, dear friends, in the coming week, I ask you to what? Live with more forgiveness, more reconciliation, more honesty. So the first three paragraphs I'm suggesting is the indicative. Lincoln is announcing the Almighty has his own purposes. But the last paragraph is what I would call the imperative. What are we to do about this? How are we to respond? In our textbooks in the United States, students, if they learn anything about Lincoln, will only probably hear this last paragraph. But the last paragraph makes no sense unless we've also heard the first three paragraphs. So I'm going to suggest in conclusion, to give you a moment to think about this, that we say this last paragraph out loud. Because I think that this paragraph, as much as we have to remember that Lincoln is a 19th century person, he cannot answer 21st century questions. But yet somehow he's a person of worldwide significance who kind of offers to people a kind of spirit, a way we can approach things in a remarkable way. I've had Muslims, I've had Jews come to me and tell me that this document really, really speaks to them. So I'm suggesting that the last paragraph might be an imperative for us. I don't know your situation, you don't really know mine in many ways, but we all are in need of this kind of reconciling leadership today. Let's say the last paragraph together. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Thank you very much. Now we'll have some questions and comments, and I'll repeat what you say so we all can hear. We didn't say anything about Grant, so if you want to ask a question about Grant too, but that we had to limit our focus. While you think, yes.
You do you achieve what Lincoln is, as you say, suggested we achieve? In a world with a 24/7 news cycle, with Twitter and digital age, which we all contend with every day.
Thank you. Is there another question? The question or the comment is that I attempted to show how Lincoln's spirit and ideas could be helpful in a modern situation. But how do you do this in a 24/7 news cycle with social media? How we are bombarded again and again and again. Interestingly, the founders of the United States thought that there was a real advantage in the fact that the country was so large, even at the beginning, that it would take a while for people to get a news that would, and this might mellow out their anger or their temper, that it would take time for them to say, well, okay, I'm angry now, but 4 days later when I finally have time to think about it. And so don't you and I find, even in our own way, when I talked about Lincoln never signed, never sent, did you ever feel that way about the email or the text that you sent? It's very, very difficult. And I worry, speaking for our country, that I think we have to have leaders who are, first of all, conscious of history, who are readers, who understand widely. We've kind of, I think, fallen into the trap of electing people who don't have any experience. Say, well, my great credibility is that I have no experience. I'm a real estate person, or I'm this, or I'm that, or I'm a talk show host. I find that just almost incredible. I mean, people have sometimes said, well, Lincoln didn't have much experience, but that's really not true. He served 4 times, 8 years in the state legislature. He served 2 years in the United States Congress. So he did have experience, and he brought this to the task. Unless it seemed like I'm making Lincoln taller than 6'4". By the way, if he arrived today in New Zealand, he'd probably be 6'10". People were very much smaller in the 19th century. In his early years, he could be sarcastic. His humor could bite. One day in Springfield, he learned that someone was speaking against his particularly political ideology, and he rushed over and saw this man had some sort of disability, and Lincoln mimicked the man in his answer. And the man broke down in tears and ran out of the room. Lincoln later went and found him and apologized. So there is a process of maturation here by which Lincoln becomes this person. But you watch the photographs of him, he dies at just barely 56. In my biography, I have his photograph literally in every chapter. And you watch the aging process that happens in just 4 years. It's just amazing. I'm not really answering your question, but it's just so difficult to know how to do this in this 24/7 news cycle where the phone really has got us. It's addicted us. Yeah, especially young people. Yes?
So I grew up in the U.S.,
Oh.
tell by my accent, and did a lot of study on Lincoln as I
Yes.
was doing that. When I went through high school, it was very well established that slavery was the cause of the Civil War.
Oh.
By the time I went to university, that dialogue had started to change into it was really a war about the states' rights, etc.
Sure.
And I guess the question that I have is, in your role as a biographer, as a studier of Lincoln, did he come into the office understanding that slavery was the root of all of this, or did he mature during the course of the war to come to that realization?
Wonderful question. He makes the point that growing up in the United States, in high school, he understood that slavery was the cause of the war. Then when he got to college or university, he understood other narratives. So his question is, did Lincoln enter the Civil War believing that slavery was the cause of the war and or the solution to it, perhaps? Actually, I believe his solution was to save the Union. It was not to free the slaves. So, your words, this was a process of maturity. He came to this decision over the course of 2.5 years. And what he wanted to do, we have in what we call border states, these were states situated just on the border between the South and the North. He offered them at one point, he said, I'll pay for your slaves. And you don't have to emancipate them all the way until 1895. I'll pay for every one of your slaves because they claimed they were property. And when they rejected this, he said, okay, if you're not even willing to enter into this kind of bargain, then I'm going to emancipate all of them in my, not all of them at first, but in my role as commander-in-chief. So I think this is something that he came to. And when he gets to the Gettysburg Address, he says, we need a new birth of freedom. And he recognized that for him, the Declaration of Independence was kind of a reforming document, but it still had to be reforming. All men are created equal. Well, that meant white men of property. It did not mean women, and it did not mean African Americans. So Lincoln saw the Declaration of Independence as an aspirational document, and he was going to take it the next step to free the African American slaves. His last speech, which he gave 2 days after the victory and the armistice at Appomattox, we often make the mistake of thinking Lincoln was this spontaneous speaker. Many people think the Gettysburg Address was written on the back of a flap of an envelope on the train to Gettysburg. Absolutely not. Lincoln was a careful speaker. I say to students, there's no such thing as great writing. There's only great rewriting. So the night after the victory, everybody came to serenade him, and Lincoln said, would you please come back tomorrow? I'm not ready to say anything tonight. So the next night he did say something, and John Wilkes Booth, who would assassinate him, was in the audience, and he said, we have 180,000 Union soldiers who are black. I just think that some of these may deserve the vote. What have they done for the country? I think we have to think about enfranchising these African Americans. He didn't even say all of them, but just some. John Wilkes Booth said to a friend, that's the last words this nigger lover is ever going to speak. So Lincoln was on a journey. And interestingly, when he was assassinated, this was a shock to me, some of his own Republican colleagues, senators, said, almost we're glad Lincoln was too soft. He was too soft. He wanted to let states back into the Union who had 10% of their votes to come into the Union. He was a very magnanimous person. And so they turned on the South, his own Republican Party. We're going to punish this region for what they have done. That would not have been Lincoln's spirit at all. Yes?
I wanted to ask you mentioned Mary.
Yes.
And Mary's got a particularly bad rap from historians, really. And I wondered whether you wanted to make any comment about her role.
Yes. I'd love to. You asked the question about Mary. Mary Lincoln has not fared well in historical narrative. I'm more empathetic to her. She lost Eddie at 3 1/2 in 1850, Willie at age 11, Tad at age 17. She was holding her husband's hand when he was assassinated. She was his advisor in Springfield in many ways. She was better educated than he was. And she saw him as his terrific potential before he did. And she pushed him and prodded him, and she was his advisor. And then she gets to Washington, and she's treated by the women of Washington as a Western rube from out there on the frontier. They wouldn't give her any credit for anything. And suddenly she's not his advisor. The members of his cabinet become his advisor. And so I think she really struggled with her role. Not to say she couldn't be a difficult person. Lincoln's secretaries called her a hellcat. So I'm not dismissing that. But I guess I'm a little more sympathetic to everything that she went through. Yes?
Yes, I'd like to go back to the question that John asked about the relevance of Lincoln for today.
Yes.
But pose a slightly different question.
Yes.
So in your country at the moment, you have a very polarized society. It's not just one division, but multiple divisions, but they're deep and they're complex. And whereas in the middle of the 19th century, there was a relatively common belief structure, the vast majority of people were Christian of some kind.
Yes.
That is no longer the case. And within the Christian community, there are enormous divisions as well.
Yes.
So, as one thinks about the kind of leadership that one needs, instead of Trump, that can speak into this generation and the challenges that America faces, that the world faces, which are multiple. How can one be a Lincoln today? In other words, what are the things that can unite? What are the messages today, if you like, and provide a vision for the future.
The comment was so well spoken of the problems that the United States faces today, but much of the world does too. And deeply polarized nation, deeply divisive nation. You suggesting that in the 19th century there was more of a unanimity, more people shared a kind of common Christian faith. Let me just pause there for a moment. Yes and no. In the United States in the 19th century, every major city had a Republican newspaper and a Democratic newspaper. And often the publisher or the editor was a member of Congress. And so in Chicago, you had the Chicago Tribune, which was a Republican paper, and the Chicago Times, which was a Democratic paper. But the difference was many people read both. They read both. Today we're living in silos. So in the United States, some people watch CNN and other people watch Fox News. And it's like we're in two different universes. So even the way the virus is being treated, I mean, it seems like Trump is trying to use some kind of pseudoscience, and all of his supporters are saying everything is going great, it's all going to be fine, and go back to work tomorrow. Well, that's not the way CNN is reporting it, but Fox News is reporting it in a completely different way. So back to the 24/7, the news cycles are playing a role here that they never played before. I'm always asked the question, well, wasn't the Civil War as divisive or more divisive? At one level, you might say it was, but at another level, I would say, no, it wasn't, because people were getting... Lincoln was a great example. He said to his law partner, William Herndon, I need to know what the South is thinking. So he is subscribed to the leading newspaper in Richmond, Virginia, and Charleston, South Carolina. He says, it's not that I agree with these newspapers, but I need to know what they're thinking. If I don't know what they're thinking, how can I possibly be a politician in this moment? So I think part of the problem is, I don't know if you've had this experience here, but the four of us have had this experience. It's almost impossible to talk to people of the other side anymore. It's like, my goodness. I think we need to try, but it's extremely difficult. So what kind of leader would this be? A leader who's willing to respect the other side, to be a healing type of person, to be able to talk across divisions. We'll see what happens. I mean, Joe Biden says that he believes he can still reach out to Republicans once Trump is gone. Whether he can or not is yet to be discerned, but we need a leader who can reach across, who's a healing kind of person, and who is not so self-absorbed, who's willing to admit his or her mistakes and then learn from them and have a sense of humor. There's no sense of humor whatsoever today. I mean, Bill Clinton had a great sense of humor. Barack Obama had a great sense of humor to kind of, and laugh at yourself. Can you laugh at yourself? Lincoln was fantastic. On a Sunday afternoon, there were many more newspapers in those days. He would have the newsboy bring in the newspapers, and one afternoon he was reading like 7 different newspapers. And at the end of the 7th newspaper, he turned to his secretary and he said, Lincoln, you really are a dog. He understood that people were criticizing him, but he wasn't, like that. He wasn't a counterpuncher. He just sort of, I guess it goes with the territory, and he laughed, That takes a lot for a person to be that kind of person. And people have said to me, understandably, how could you in a nation of almost 350 million people not come up with better leaders? Here, this tiny, tiny nation came up with Jefferson and Adams and Franklin, all these great persons. It is quite remarkable that when people say, well, who's on the horizon? I don't know that I can really answer who's on the horizon that can step forward and say, okay, this will be that healing figure. Yes?
I first heard you speak to this same address, 2000 at San Francisco Theological Seminary.
Really?
Yeah. Good to see you again.
Oh, thank you.
Remember me? Of course. In Lincoln's magnanimous spirit, as in fact reflected in the first 2 phrases of the last paragraph,
right.
Malice toward none, charity for all.
Right.
He also, though, said with firmness in the right.
Absolutely.
And his previous paragraphs definitely speak to what he felt was right.
Yes.
And it seems like somehow that being willing to be firm in what you believe, even with charity and malice towards none, is one of those things that we need today.
We do need that today. And Lincoln was willing to go against, he would consult his cabinet. He would take a kind of straw vote. But, I mean, the vote, should he resupply Fort Sumter? The vote was 6-2 not to do it. And he said, thank you very much. I'm going to resupply Fort Sumter. So you do have to have someone who has a trust in their own thinking and is willing. There's a place and time to be firm. Thank you for lifting that up. I think that's very, wouldn't want to miss that point of this part of this address. Yes?
I was really more sort of comment on top of that one. I think what really strikes me here is first of all, someone really going through a moral, quite a complicated moral debate with themselves.
Yes, yes.
Trying to wrestle and come out the other end.
Uh-huh.
But where it really is working at a quite high moral level.
Yes.
Is he is also concluding that this is something we have to go through.
Yes.
So it appears impractical, but we have to. It's like the storm, tropical.
We have to go through it.
We all come on May to get through it.
Yes.
And you could see them in modern. I mean, it's myro issues that we could. Climate change is one of these.
Yep.
If you rise above all the, we must do something. But on the other hand, we want to have large cars and large houses, and this is just taking it right above that. So,
I love what you're saying. You're saying that he's arguing, he's talking at a high moral level. You can't dumb it down. You can't simplify it. It's tough. It's difficult. There's often no simple answers. And when I talk about what I call Lincoln's faith journey, I meant to say in my writing of biographies, I believe one of the missing elements is the faith story, at least as the American biographies, of how that's written. So I wanted to tease out, if I could, the faith story in Lincoln, which is a Presbyterian story, or the faith story in Ulysses S. Grant, which is a Methodist story, or the biography I'm working on now of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the hero of Little Round Top at Gettysburg, which is a congregational faith story. But unknown to anybody, on September 2nd, 1862, after the Union had suffered yet again another disastrous defeat, Lincoln called an emergency cabinet meeting. Fortunately, in that day, 3 members of the cabinet kept diaries, so we know what took place. And one of the members of the cabinet said, Lincoln said he was so distraught, he almost felt like hanging himself. He almost felt like hanging himself. And then we believe that afternoon he sat down, took a little piece of paper, the lines were blue, we have that paper, and he wrote out this thought. He didn't date it, he didn't title it, and he didn't sign it. It's now at Brown University because John Hay, his secretary, was a graduate of Brown. And Lincoln begins, the will of God prevails. In each contest, each side claims that they are following the will of God. One must be, both can't be right. And then he offers this profound observation. It may be that God's purpose is different from the purpose of either party. And yet God uses human effort to effect his purpose. And then the man who's supposed to be ending this war concludes what John Hay calls the meditation on the divine will by saying, I'm really not sure. And the war goes on. I don't know the conclusion to this. So Lincoln never thought we would ever see this. But there's 119 of these little notes that have been left behind. They were called fragments by his secretaries because they often end in the middle of a sentence or the middle of a word. And a new book that I'm publishing, will be published in February of next year, is called Abraham Lincoln in Private, His Notes to Self. In one of these notes, he had run for a second time for the United States Senate and lost the second time. He starts out and he says, well, Stephen Douglas, who's his great rival in Illinois, we met 22 years ago, so we can tell the date of that thing. We know when they met. He said, we were both ambitious. I was probably more ambitious than he was. He said, Stephen Douglas has risen to the highest eminence, but as for me, my life is nothing but a failure. Nothing but a flat failure. In less than 4 years, he'll be President of the United States. Well, he would never have said that in public. My life is a failure. But this is Lincoln's, I think, the way he's working out this high moral thing. by continually having a kind of intellectual debate or conversation with himself. He writes another one that says, well, some people say that slavery is based on color. So if you meet a man that's a different color than you are, then he has a right to make you his slave. Well, maybe slavery is actually based on intelligence. But what if you meet a man who's more intelligent than you are? Would you therefore become his slave? And he goes on and on and on. He never says any of this in a public address. But here's a man wrestling intellectually, morally, with these deep questions. It's just phenomenal. 1 year of formal education. Don't want to go on too long, but is there another comment or question? Yes?
You made a fascinating remark in passing about how reading's online. And I wonder to what extent Lincoln's own experience of being in a dominant Protestant culture where the sermon and the reading of the Bible, the coffee readers, all these sorts of things all built on each other.
Yes.
In a way that's not now the case.
Yes.
There's an American late Jesuit theologian called John A. Hartman who did analysis sort of saying how Protestantism destroyed the visual capacity. And he said in the late 70s with the new technologies that was going to be reintroduced. And so now you're getting a sort of politics of spectacle, of colour. And for many of us who grew up in the more literate, older generation, we find some politicians and others, and celebrities, difficult to deal with. There's no consecutive thought, there's short tweets, all these sorts of things. And the attention span is short. Even Pope Francis has told us as priests, preach shorter sermons because they haven't got the attention span. In those days, you used to know serious. And so we're looking at where we're going with this sort of thing. Lincoln, in a sense, represents a different world to that which we're going into. There are things we would like to take from it. The question is, how do we now try to get the best of both? Sort of, and how do we critique this new politics of spectacle and drama?
Wow, you've said it so well. Yes, Lincoln lived in a different world, a literate world, a world where the sermon was important, where the sermon was long. And now we live in a different world. I would want to point out that this is the second shortest inaugural address ever offered. Most of them are 35 to 40 minutes. George Washington offered the shortest one. There was no tradition. He stood up and in 135 words said something like, "Thank you very much," and sat down. But of course, I know you're not suggesting that Donald Trump's tweets are the way of literacy today. But you and I worry terribly about the attention span of young people. I have a friend who teaches at the University of Southern California, and he said for the first time ever, young people just get up and walk right out of his seminar. Just get up and leave. They're not going to the bathroom, they're consulting their phone. He said he's never experienced this in his 35 years of teaching. And they think nothing of it. So it is a problem, but I guess I'm not yet willing to give up on the literate. I once was consulted by a member of the Senate who was thinking of running for the presidency. I was in Washington for a sort of fellowship. And he said to me, most of my fellow senators are not good public speakers. And we're also, I don't know, I can't speak of your culture, but there's kind of a cynicism even about public speaking. And then I hate the teleprompter, because the teleprompter often allows the person simply to read what should be spoken. And so there's a difference between reading and speaking. I'm trying to speak without notes because I want to connect with you and your faces and the way you're responding. And what I'm saying here is not what I said several nights ago, and not what I will say in Dunedin. I'm trying to be conscious of the audience. Lincoln was conscious of his audience. That was part of his power. And I think the modern politician just gives the same speech over and over and over again, let's see, are we in Colorado today or is it Texas, And part of Lincoln's ability was his willingness to listen carefully to the other side. He starts out one of his great speeches, and he starts out by saying, "I know that many of you do not agree with me. I know that many of you do not agree with me. Would you give me a moment to try to present my side of the issue?" Today, we would have all people rallying here for a Republican candidate, all people here, they all agree. So the art of rhetoric is the art of persuasion. And in the treatise on rhetoric, the ancient treatise, it starts with the integrity of the speaker. We can sense, can we not, if the speaker is a person of integrity and truthfulness. And the second quality is the art of persuasion. This is why we learn, or should learn, debate. I don't know about your school system, but in the 19th century, rhetoric was a required course in every college and university. Now it's an elective, speech communication. Do it if you want. We've lost sense of the power of public speaking, even with the attention span. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I'm offering a few observations. Yeah. Yes. What I take from your wonderful comments is what is primary is, do our politics take over our Christian faith, or does our Christian faith influence our politics? That seems to me a very divisive issue today. And so traditionally when I speak and people ask me a contemporary question, I say, I'm an historian. So I shouldn't say that. When I mentioned Biden, I think we in the United States need a more healing figure, a person who can bring us more together. So you've asked the most difficult question, and what you've also said in your comment was that there's no longer a common faith or even a common political understanding. How did we get to this? David Brooks, the wonderful columnist, conservative columnist for the New York Times, speaks of this as the hyper-individualism of our society. We have lost a sense of community. We are so individualistic that that's the problem of how we cannot reach across to others. Asian society and many other societies start more from the standpoint of the community. Is the Bible really the story of individuals, or is it the story of a people? The way you answer that question may have a lot to do with the way you would choose to live your life. So I'm lifting up the faith dimension. Can this be lifted up in the 21st century? I still think it can if you do it with Lincoln's way of using inclusive language, of being respectful of those who are on the other side, of having civility, of having humility. As he travels to Washington, and I'll conclude with this, he speaks to the legislators in New Jersey, and he said, "My hope is that I can be a humble instrument in the hands of the Almighty and this almost chosen people." If I could have dinner or lunch with Abraham Lincoln, I'd like to ask him, what did you mean by almost? But what I would like to do, and if I get there, to another book, is to say that the people I want to follow are those who are willing to say almost. On the right, everything is great sometimes. On the left, everything is wrong. I think each society is an almost society. It's a society still in process where we need more justice, more inclusivity. And that's why I lifted up Lincoln this afternoon. I think that he's an example of this kind of politician. And I still want to believe that that sort of politics is possible in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
You hinted before that we each have leadership capacity and a leadership responsibility. And I was going to ask you what you thought if you were going to be preaching to us today, which I know is not what you were doing, but what would be the imperative? I think you've just summarised the imperative for each of us today, each of us who have heard what you've brought from your deep, deep understanding of Lincoln, who he was, his character, and the contribution that he has made. And the way that you have included us in your conversation this afternoon has been most magnanimous, most enthralling and educative. So on behalf of us all, I want to express our gratitude for the way that you have shared with us your insight to this character of history and the contribution that he makes, not only to the political leadership of today, but for all of us in whatever fields we're in, whatever it is that our responsibilities call us to take insight from the words that he's written in this second inaugural address. So thank you so much for sharing with us, and we wish you and Cynthia and Patty and Jim all the best for the rest of your stay. We're very, very grateful that whilst on vacation you're willing to share with us in this way and to take the time and the energy to do so. We can tell that you've got a passion for it, but we appreciate it so much. So let's offer our thanks again to Dr. White. Now, there is tea and coffee available, so don't rush away. I think Dr. White's happy to stay for a bit if you'd like to chat with him. Before you go, I invite you to talk to someone around you about what it was that struck you about the address that Dr. White shared with us today. What is it that is most meaningful for you? So share that before you go and enjoy. Thank you to Banu and to Kevin as well for hosting us this afternoon. We're very grateful to you. So thank you all again for coming and chat with those around you before you go.